It started off like any other long haul, heading east from California towards Chicago. I picked up a load of computer parts in San Jose and hit the road early afternoon. The drive through the desert was brutal as always. Scorching heat, mile after mile of nothing but sand and cacti, but I'm used to that grind. Somewhere in the middle of nowhere, Nevada, my truck started acting up. The RPMs were all over the place. It was chugging and sputtering like it was about to die. I pulled off at the next exit, which was just a lonely desert road. There weren't even any buildings or gas stations around. I popped the hood and saw a bunch of black gunk caked up around the engine. Fantastic. I spent over an hour out there in the 110-degree heat, sweating my ass off trying to clean off the engine components. Finally got it cleared out enough that the truck seemed to be running properly again. As night fell, I got back on the loneliest stretch of I-80 you've ever seen. Not a soul around for miles, just my rig's headlights cutting through the inky blackness. I turned up the radio to stay awake, singing along to some old road tunes. That's when I noticed something in my rearview mirror. At first I thought it was just my sleep-deprived eyes playing tricks on me. But as I looked closer, I could clearly make out a pair of headlights way back there, keeping persistent pace with me, haunting me. No way someone's actually following me out here, I thought. I'm just being paranoid. But those headlights weren't falling back or passing me. They stuck to my tail like a barnacle, no matter how much I accelerated. An uneasy feeling started creeping over me. I pushed the pedal down and my rig shot up to 80. The mystery driver matched me, those demonic headlights burning in behind. At this point, my heart was pounding. I watched too many creepy truck driver videos, and every possible horror scenario started flashing through my mind. Was it someone trying to run me off the road and steal my cargo? A deranged serial killer just messing with me? Or worse, someone I'd pissed off in the past who was looking for payback. For a while it was just this demented game of cat and mouse under the pale desert moonlight. I'd speed up, they'd speed up. I'd slow down, they'd mimic me. All while putting some ungodly distance between us. My nerves were shot. I was running on fumes after driving for so long already, but I was too scared to pull over, too terrified of whatever was stalking me. This went on for what felt like an eternity. Just me, my rig, and those two soulless eyes in the mirror glaring from out of the darkness. I cranked up the music as loud as it would go, trying to drown out the maddening possibilities in my head. Finally, after several hours, the road curved and sloped upwards, taking me up and over a ridge. As my trailer crested the hill, I looked down in the side mirror at those haunting headlights. That's when I saw them. Two bloodied, skeletal hands gripping my trailer's edge. My heart nearly stopped. For a split second, I could have sworn I saw a decaying face appear in the rear view, grinning at me through shredded, rotting flesh. Paralyzed with fear, I slammed on the brakes as hard as I could. The trailer jackknifed and whipped around violently, spinning out of control and metal screeching across asphalt. I don't know how, but I managed to wrestle the rig to a stop. The trailer fishtailed to a halt beside me in a deafening screech of tortured steel. I sat there frozen, white-knuckled on the wheel in total silence for what felt like an eternity. Every hair on my body was on end. I didn't dare look in the mirrors again. Didn't want to know what was back there. Eventually, I threw the truck into gear and just rolled away with the trailer crunched up and sparking beside me. I didn't stop driving until I hit a truck stop in Utah, over 400 miles away. I haven't taken any long hauls since. Just short routes, sticking to busier roads. Can't get those images out of my head. I was driving a load of furniture from Atlanta to Denver. It's a long haul, and I like to drive through the night when the roads are quieter, and the stars are just me and my thoughts. The route took me through some remote parts of Kansas, where the landscape is more open sky than land. So, there I was, cruising down a particularly lonely stretch of I-70. It's around 2 a.m., and the only light for miles is coming from my headlights and the occasional distant porch light flickering in the vast emptiness. I'm listening to some late-night talk radio show to keep my mind occupied. The hosts talking about ghost towns, which set an eerie tone to begin with. Suddenly, my radio starts to static. I smack it a few times. Old school fix, right? But no good. It just dies completely. No big deal, I think. I'll just ride in silence for a bit. But that silence quickly became suffocating, almost tangible in its density. As I'm trying to shake the unease settling in my chest, I notice something up ahead on the road. At first, I think it's debris, which is bad news on a highway. But as I get closer, I see it's a car, an old sedan, parked sideways across both lanes. No hazard lights, no street lights, nothing. Just an ominously empty car blocking the road in the dead of night. Now my first thought is there's been an accident, so I slow down and pull over, figuring I might have to help out. I grab my flashlight and step out, and immediately the air hits me. It's dead silent. No wind, no distant animal sounds, nothing. It felt off. I approach the sedan, flashlight in hand, and it's empty. No sign of a driver, no sign of a struggle. The doors are all closed and there's no damage to the car. It's like someone just parked it there and vanished into thin air. Feeling more nervous by the second, I walk around to check the back of the sedan, and that's when I hear it, a soft, thumping sound. I stop, heart racing, and listen. It's coming from the trunk. Now, every horror movie I've ever seen is flashing through my mind, but I think about how I'd feel if I were stuck in there. So, I pull out my phone to call 911. But of course, no signal. I debate for a moment, then decide I have to open the trunk. I take a deep breath, steel myself, and pop it open. Nothing. There's absolutely nothing inside. No body, no bomb, no stash of bugs, just an empty trunk. I'm baffled and frankly freaked out. Then I hear a car door slam shut behind me. I whirl around, flashlight slicing through the darkness, and there's nothing. My truck is just as I left it. Doors closed, lights off. But then, I see it. The driver's door of the sedan is now open. My heart skips about 10 beats. I didn't open that door. I'm sure of it. Panic setting in, I sprint back to my truck, lock the doors, and start it up. I maneuver around the sedan, my eyes glued to my mirrors until it's out of sight. I don't stop looking over my shoulder until I hit the next town, where I pull into a diner parking lot, finally under some bright lights. I told a local cop about it when he came in for coffee. He said they'd check it out, but I never heard anything more. Drove the rest of the way to Denver with the cab lights on and the doors locked tight. Never did find out what was going on with that car or who slammed that door, and maybe that's for the best. I've been a long-haul trucker for over 15 years. Seen just about everything you can imagine on the open road. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared me for that night in the middle of nowhere, Texas. It was a typical run, if you can call any part of this job typical. I was hauling a full load of electronics from Houston up to Chicago. The route's familiar. The truck was running smooth, and I had my favorite tunes playing. The day was uneventful, and as night began to fall, I decided to push through to make up some time. Around midnight, I'm deep into this rural stretch of highway. Not a soul in sight for miles, just me and miles of darkness, with only the occasional deer darting across the road to keep me company. I had just passed through a small town, and the next one on the map wasn't for another 80 miles or so. The perfect place, you'd think, for some peace and quiet. but it was just too quiet, even for me. Then it starts. A light rain, just a sprinkle at first, but soon enough it's pouring so hard I can barely see past the hood of my rig. I slow down because the last thing I need is to jackknife out here in the middle of a downpour. The wipers are going full tilt, but they're barely keeping up. Suddenly, I see a figure on the side of the road. As I get closer, I can make out that it's a woman, soaked to the bone, waving frantically. Now, I've heard all the stories, all the warnings about picking up hitchhikers, but she looked genuine, and it was pouring rain. What kind of person would I be if I left her out there? I pull over and she runs up to the passenger side. She's young, maybe mid-20s, and terrified. She climbs in, thanking me profusely, shivering from the cold. I crank up the heat as she tells me her car broke down a few miles back and her phone died. Bad luck all around, it seemed. She's quiet at first, just staring out the window at the storm. I try to make small talk, help her relax. But she's jittery, keeps looking over her shoulder like she's expecting someone to follow us. I asked her if there was someone else with her, maybe someone else that needed help too. She shakes her head, doesn't say much after that. A few miles down the road, she suddenly perks up, points to a little dirt track veering off the highway, says that's her way home and asks if I can drop her off there. Something about it didn't feel right. It's the middle of nowhere, rain pouring down, and this dirt track looked barely drivable. But she insists, says her house isn't far down that path. I stop the truck at the start of the track. She thanks me again, hops out into the rain, and without looking back, starts walking down the path. I wait a moment, watching her disappear into the night. Something about the whole thing felt off, but what could I do? I pull back onto the highway, thoughts swirling in my head. Not even 10 minutes later, my gut twists. I see red and blue lights flashing behind me. I pull over, thinking maybe I got a taillight out or something. Cop comes up, asks for my license and registration. Routine stuff. Then he asks if I've seen a young woman walking along the highway. Chills run down my spine as I tell him about the girl I just dropped off. Turns out she's been missing. Escaped from a nearby facility where she was being treated for severe psychological issues. She had a history of luring truckers into dangerous situations. My blood ran cold as he told me. Said I was lucky I didn't follow her down that track. They'd found others who weren't so lucky, left in abandoned farmhouses in the area, robbed or worse. The officer thanked me for the info, advised me to be more careful in the future. I couldn't hit the road fast enough after that. Spent the rest of the haul glancing in my rear view, half expecting to see her running up behind me. So that's my story. Made it to Chicago without any more incidents. But I'll tell you, it was a long time before I stopped overthinking every shadow in my mirror. Now, I stick to the well-lit stops and never pick up hitchhikers, no matter the weather. It was a dark and stormy night in the middle of nowhere. The kind of night that would have even the most seasoned trucker on edge. I had been driving for hours, my eyelids growing heavy as I navigated the winding back roads of this God-forsaken stretch of highway. The rain pounded relentlessly against the windshield, obscuring my vision and making it feel like I was operating in a thick fog. I probably should have pulled over hours ago, but my delivery deadline was fast approaching and I was determined to push through. The client was counting on me and I couldn't afford to let them down. So I soldiered on, gripping the steering wheel tightly as my truck rumbled along. As I rounded a particularly sharp bend, something in the distance caught my eye. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, a flickering shadow or a stray animal darting across the road. But as I drew closer, My blood ran cold. There, on the side of the highway, was the unmistakable silhouette of a person. I slowed the truck down, heart pounding in my chest. Should I stop? My gut instinct was to just keep driving. This was the middle of nowhere, and you never knew what kind of trouble you might be getting yourself into. But something compelled me to pull over. Maybe it was the humanitarian in me, or maybe I was just too damn curious for my own good. As I brought the truck to a stop, I peered out into the darkness, straining to make out any details. The figure was hunched over, seemingly clutching their side. I could hear the faint sound of sobbing over the roar of the engine. Without thinking, I grabbed my flashlight and opened the door, stepping out into the torrential downpour. "Hello? Are you all right?" I called out, my voice barely audible above the storm. The figure stirred and slowly lifted their head. That's when I saw it. A young woman, her face streaked with tears and dirt, a deep gash across her forehead. "Oh my God," I breathed, rushing over to her side. "What happened? Are you hurt?" She looked up at me, eyes wild with fear. "Please, you have to help me," she stammered. "My car, it went off the road. I think my leg is broken." I quickly knelt down beside her, shining the flashlight over her body. Sure enough, her left leg was bent at an unnatural angle, the bone clearly protruding through the skin. I swallowed hard, trying to keep my composure. Okay, just try to stay calm," I said, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "I'm going to call for help, all right?" I pulled out my phone, but to my dismay, there was no signal. Of course, in the middle of nowhere, in the pouring rain, when I needed it most. I cursed under my breath, frantically looking around for any sign of civilization. "There has to be a town or something nearby," I said, more to myself than to her. I'll go find help. Just hang on, okay?" She reached out and grabbed my arm, her grip surprisingly strong despite her obvious pain. "No, please, don't leave me here." Her voice was laced with pure terror. I think there's something out there." I hesitated, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. "What do you mean?" "I heard it. In the woods. Something was watching me," she whispered, her eyes darting around nervously. "Please, you have to stay with me. I'm so scared." I felt a chill run down my spine. The woods surrounding us seemed to loom ominously, the trees swaying in the wind like gnarled skeletal hands. For a moment, I swore I saw a shadowy figure dart between the trunks, but I blinked and it was gone. All right, I'll stay," I conceded, my mind racing. "Just try to stay calm, okay? I'm not going anywhere." I quickly retrieved a blanket from the truck and wrapped it around the woman's shivering form, doing my best to splint her leg with some spare materials. As I worked, I couldn't shake the sense that we were being watched. I kept glancing nervously into the darkness, half expecting some unspeakable horror to come lurching out of the woods. Time seemed to crawl by as we sat there in tense silence, the only sounds the howling wind and the woman's ragged breathing. Every once in a while she would let out a whimper of pain, gripping my arm tightly. And every time, I would scan the tree line, my heart pounding in my chest. What if no one comes?" she suddenly whispered, her voice trembling. "What if we're stuck out here all night?" I swallowed hard, not wanting to voice the very same fears that had been gnawing at me. "Don't worry, help is on the way," I lied, trying to sound reassuring. "Just hang in there, okay?" She nodded weakly, closing her eyes. I could see the exhaustion etched on her face, and I knew she was rapidly slipping into shock. I had to do something, but what? There was no way I could carry her back to the truck. and even if I could, I had no idea where the nearest town or hospital was. As I sat there, helplessly watching the woman's condition deteriorate, I couldn't help but feel a growing sense of dread. The woods surrounding us seemed to press in, the shadows deepening and the eerie silence becoming deafening. And then I heard it. A faint rustling in the distance, followed by the snap of a branch. My head snapped up, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. There was no response, only the unsettling silence. The woman whimpered, clutching my arm tighter. I told you there was something out there," she whispered, her eyes wide with terror. I felt a chill run down my spine as I strained to peer into the blackness. The trees seemed to loom over us, their branches twisting and writhing like the grasping limbs of some ancient, malevolent creature. And then I saw it, a flash of movement, a glimpse of something dark and inhuman darting between the trunks. "Oh, God," I breathed, my heart pounding in my chest. "We need to get out of here, now." I quickly scooped up the woman, ignoring her cries of pain, and made a break for the truck. But as I ran, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being followed, that something was watching our every move. I could hear the branches snapping, the leaves rustling, and the unmistakable sound of heavy, labored breathing just behind us. I fumbled with the truck door, my hands shaking, and managed to get the woman inside. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my eyes frantically scanning the darkness. There was nothing there, but the sense of being watched was overwhelming. I jumped into the driver's seat and started the engine, the truck rumbling to life. As I put it in gear and started to pull away, I couldn't help but glance back, half expecting to see some horrific creature lurching towards us. But there was nothing, just the endless expanse of darkness, swallowing us whole. We drove in tense silence for what felt like an eternity, the woman's labored breathing the only sound in the cab. I kept my eyes glued to the road, my heart pounding in my chest as we put as much distance as possible between us and that God-forsaken stretch of highway. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, we spotted the faint glow of a town in the distance. I let out a shaky breath, relief washing over me. We were going to be okay, or so I thought. As we approached the town, I noticed something strange. There were no lights, no signs of life. The streets were eerily deserted, with only the faint glow of street lamps illuminating the desolate scene. "What's going on?" the woman whispered, her voice barely audible. I shook my head, my grip tightening on the steering wheel. "I don't know, but I don't like it." I slowly rolled the truck through the abandoned streets, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. Something wasn't right. I could feel it in my gut. And then I saw it, a body lying in the middle of the road. I slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding to a stop. I stared in horror at the lifeless form, my mind racing. What the hell had happened here? Suddenly, a movement in the shadows caught my eye. I whipped my head around just in time to see a figure dart across the street, disappearing into the darkness. "Did you see that?" I whispered, my voice trembling. The woman nodded, her eyes wide with fear. "We need to get out of here, now." I didn't need to be told twice. I threw the truck into reverse and floored it, the tires screeching as we peeled out of the abandoned town. As we sped away, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that whatever had taken over that town was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for its next victims. To this day, I don't know what happened in that town, what dark forces had consumed it. All I know is that I'll never forget the sheer terror I felt, the overwhelming sense of dread that gripped me as we fled that place. It's a memory that haunts me, a nightmare that refuses to let me go. I've driven a lot of miles in my time, seen a lot of strange things. But that night, on that dark and stormy highway, will forever be seared into my memory as the single most terrifying experience of my life. I've been driving these long-haul routes for nearly 2 decades now, so I like to think I've seen just about everything out there on the open road. Crazy drivers, unpredictable weather, the occasional run-in with law enforcement, it all comes with the territory. But this one incident I experienced, it really shook me to my core. And the worst part is it didn't involve any ghosts or monsters or anything supernatural. Just the very real, very terrifying actions of my fellow human beings. It was late one night, must have been around 2 a.m., and I was pushing through the last leg of my delivery. The highway was dead silent, just me and the rig cruising along. I had the radio playing softly, keeping me company as I fought to stay awake. As I rounded a particularly sharp bend, something up ahead caught my eye. At first I thought it might be a stray animal or piece of debris in the road, but as I got closer, my blood ran cold. There in the middle of the highway was a car, or at least what was left of it. It was mangled beyond belief, the twisted metal and shattered glass a clear sign of a horrific collision. I immediately started slowing down, my heart pounding in my chest. "Oh, God," I muttered, my eyes scanning the scene for any sign of life. That's when I saw them. 2 figures, one crumpled on the ground, the other stumbling around aimlessly. I threw the truck into park and jumped out, rushing over to offer aid. As I got closer, I could see the first figure was a young woman, her clothes soaked in blood. She was unconscious, her breathing shallow and labored. The other figure, a man, was staggering around in a daze, clutching his head. "Hey, are you all right?" I called out, my voice laced with urgency. "What happened?" The man looked up at me, his eyes wild and unfocused. We were run off the road," he slurred, his words barely coherent. They just came out of nowhere and..." He trailed off, wincing in pain. I didn't hesitate, quickly pulling out my cell phone to call for help. But to my dismay, there was no signal. Of course, in the middle of nowhere when I needed it most. I cursed under my breath, quickly assessing the situation. The woman needed medical attention, and fast. I had to get her to a hospital, but how? I couldn't just leave the man here, and I couldn't possibly move the woman on my own. "All right, listen," I said, placing a hand on the man's shoulder. "I'm gonna go try and find help, okay? Just stay with her. Keep pressure on that wound. I'll be back as soon as I can." He nodded weakly, his eyes already starting to droop. I gave the woman's hand a gentle squeeze, then turned and sprinted back to my truck. I had to find the nearest town, get emergency services out here immediately. As I sped down the highway, my mind raced with 1,000 horrific scenarios. What if the people who did this were still out there, waiting to strike again? What if the woman didn't make it? The guilt and fear were overwhelming, and I felt my hands trembling on the steering wheel. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I spotted the faint glow of streetlights in the distance. I let out a shaky breath, pressing the accelerator to the floor. But as I approached the town, something felt off. There were no cars on the road, no lights in the windows. It was dead silent, like a ghost town. I slowed the truck to a crawl, my eyes scanning the empty streets. That's when I saw it. A body lying motionless in the middle of the intersection. I slammed on the brakes, my heart pounding in my chest. "What the hell?" I whispered, staring in horror at the lifeless form. I sat there for a moment, my mind racing. Should I go check it out? What if it was a trap? Every instinct told me to turn around and get the hell out of there. But I knew I couldn't just abandon the woman and the man back on the highway. With a deep breath, I stepped out of the truck, my legs shaking slightly. I approached the body cautiously, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. As I got closer, I felt my stomach twist into knots. It was a man. His throat is... his lifeless eyes staring blankly at the sky. I took a step back, my hand flying to my mouth to stifle a cry of horror. What the hell was going on in this town? I didn't dare linger, quickly turning and sprinting back to the truck. I had to get out of there, had to find help somewhere else. As I peeled out, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I drove for what felt like hours, my heart pounding in my chest the entire time. Finally, I spotted the lights of a larger city up ahead, and I let out a shaky breath of relief. I pulled into the first police station I could find, stumbling out of the truck and practically falling through the front doors. The officers looked at me, eyes widened with concern. "Sir, what's wrong? What happened?" I frantically explained the situation, my words tumbling out in a panicked jumble. They didn't waste a second, immediately calling for backup and dispatch to head to the scene. As I sat in the station, waiting anxiously for news, I couldn't help but replay the events of the night over and over in my mind. The mangled car, the injured woman, the lifeless body in the middle of the ghost town. What the hell had happened out there? And who was responsible? The police eventually returned, their expressions grave. "We found the accident site," one of the officers said, "but the victims were gone. And the town?" He shook his head, a troubled look in his eyes. "It's a massacre, plain and simple." I felt my blood run cold, the implications of his words sinking in. Whatever had happened, it was beyond horrific. And the victims, the woman, the man, were out there somewhere, in the hands of whoever had committed these unspeakable acts. To this day, I don't know what became of them. The police investigation hit a dead end, and the case went cold. All I know is that I can't shake the memory of that night, the sense of helplessness and dread that gripped me. I still drive those long haul routes, but I avoid that stretch of highway like the plague. Something about it, it just feels wrong. And every time I pass by, I can't help but wonder, what if I had gotten there sooner? What if I had been able to do more? I've been driving these long hauls for over 20 years, seen just about everything on the open road. But there was one night, I'll never forget it. It was a real creepy one, man. The kind that makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. It was late, real late, and I was just trying to power through, get this delivery done so I could finally get home and crash. The highway was empty, just me and the rig cruising through the darkness. I had the radio cranked, trying to stay awake, when suddenly something up ahead caught my eye. At first I thought it was just a busted down car or something, but as I got closer, my stomach dropped. There, in the middle of the road, was a figure, a person, just standing there completely still. I hit the brakes hard, the tires squealing as the truck came to a stop. I sat there for a minute, staring out the windshield, trying to figure out what the hell was going on. Against my better judgment, I decided to check it out. I mean, you can't just leave someone stranded out here, right? So I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out into the night. "Hey, you okay?" I called out, my voice echoing through the eerie silence. The figure didn't move, didn't even twitch. I edged closer, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. That's when I saw it. The person's face was completely blank. No expression whatsoever. It was like they weren't even there, just an empty shell. I felt a chill run down my spine, and I took a step back, my heart pounding in my chest. Suddenly, the figure jerked towards me, letting out a bone-chilling scream that made my blood run cold. I jumped back, fumbling for the truck door, but the thing was fast. It lunged at me, its hands reaching out like claws. I didn't even think, I just bolted. Ran like hell back to the rig, jumped in, and slammed the door behind me. I sat there, breathing hard, trying to process what the hell just happened. Whatever that thing was, it sure as hell wasn't human. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see it chasing after me. But the road was empty, the figure nowhere to be seen. I let out a shaky breath, my hands trembling as I put the truck in gear and took off. I must have driven for hours, putting as much distance between me and that stretch of highway as possible. Every noise, every shadow had me jumping out of my skin. I just kept thinking, what if that thing comes after me? What if it's waiting for me down the road? Finally, I spotted the lights of a small town up ahead. I let out a sigh of relief, pulling into the first gas station I could find. I practically fell out of the truck, my legs feeling like jelly. The attendant looked at me, kinda concerned. "You all right, buddy?" he asked. "You look like you seen a ghost." I shook my head, trying to catch my breath. "Man, you have no idea," I said. "I just had the craziest encounter out on the highway. This thing, I don't even know what it was, but it sure as hell wasn't human." The attendant just stared at me, eyebrows raised. "You're pulling my leg, right?" I held up my hands, deadly serious. "I swear it's the truth. I don't know what the hell that thing was, but I ain't going back that way. Not for all the money in the world." He shook his head, probably thinking I was losing it. But I didn't care. I knew what I saw, and it was the stuff of nightmares. I ended up calling the cops, trying to report what had happened. But of course, they just brushed it off, said I was probably just seeing things. Guess they don't get a lot of reports of creepy, inhuman figures standing in the middle of the road. I tried to put it out of my mind, focus on the job, but it wasn't easy. Every time I hit the highway, I couldn't help but glance in the rear view, half expecting to see that thing chasing me down. I even started taking the long way around, adding hours to my trips just to avoid that cursed stretch of road. To this day, I still can't shake the memory of that night. The way that thing moved, the look in its eyes, it was just wrong, on a level I can't even begin to describe. I swear, sometimes I still hear its scream echoing in my head, sending chills down my spine. I know what I saw, and I know it wasn't human. Whatever it wasn't from this world. And I'll be damned if I'm ever going back there to find out. Back in 2016, I was driving a long haul from Chicago to Los Angeles, taking I-55 most of the way down. It was late spring, and the weather was perfect for driving, clear skies and mild temperatures. I'd been on the road for a good 12 hours when I decided to take a break at a rest stop near St. Louis. The rest stop was pretty standard, just a parking lot with some picnic tables, vending machines, and a small building with bathrooms. There were a few other trucks there, but it was quiet. I parked my rig and got out to stretch my legs. After a quick walk around, I decided to grab a snack from the vending machine and head back to my truck. As I was making my way back, I noticed an old, beat-up van parked near the edge of the lot. There was something off about it. It looked like it hadn't been driven in years, covered in dirt and grime with flat tires and broken windows. I didn't think much of it at first, but as I walked by, I got this weird feeling like I was being watched. I shrugged it off and climbed back into my cab. Locking the doors behind me, I settled into the sleeper berth and closed my eyes, hoping to catch a quick nap before hitting the road again. That's when I heard it. A faint scratching sound, like someone or something was brushing against the side of my truck. I sat up and listened, my heart starting to race. The scratching continued, getting louder and more insistent. I peeked out the window but couldn't see anything. My mind was racing with possibilities. Maybe it was an animal or some prankster messing with me. I decided to check it out, grabbing my flashlight and stepping cautiously out of the truck. The lot was eerily quiet, and the scratching sound had stopped. I walked around my truck, shining the light along the sides, but there was nothing there. Just as I was about to head back inside, I noticed movement near the old van. The flashlight beam caught a figure crouching by the van's side, half hidden in the shadows. It was a man, dirty and disheveled, with wild hair and clothes that looked like they were falling apart. He was scratching at the van's door, muttering to himself. I called out to him, asking if he was okay, but he didn't respond. He just kept scratching and muttering, like he was in some kind of trance. I took a step closer, trying to get a better look. And that's when he turned to face me. His eyes were wide and vacant, like he was staring right through me. His face was gaunt, and he looked like he hadn't eaten in days. He started to stand up, and I realized just how tall and lanky he was, almost unnaturally so. I backed away, my heart pounding. Something about him was deeply unsettling, like he didn't belong in this world. He took a step toward me, still muttering, and I decided I'd seen enough. I turned and bolted back to my truck, locking the doors and fumbling for my keys. As I started the engine, I glanced back and saw him standing there, just watching me with those empty eyes. I didn't wait to find out what he wanted. I pulled out of the rest stop and got back on the highway, not stopping until I reached the next town. I found a well-lit truck stop and parked among other trucks, finally feeling a bit safer. Later, I heard stories from other truckers about that rest stop. They said it had been abandoned for years and that the van had been there even longer. Some claimed it was haunted. Others said it was just a place where drifters and lost souls ended up. Whatever the case, I've never stopped there again, and I advise anyone driving that route to keep going no matter how tired you are. The road has a way of showing you things you'd rather not see, and sometimes it's best to keep moving. This happened about 10 years ago when I was driving a route that took me through the remote parts of Nevada and California. I've been a trucker for most of my life, and while I've had my fair share of strange encounters, nothing ever quite matched this. I was hauling a load of electronics from Las Vegas to San Francisco. I left Vegas late in the evening to avoid the daytime heat. By midnight, I was deep into the desolate stretches of U.S. Route 95. If you've ever driven through Nevada, you know how empty and eerie those roads can be. It's just miles and miles of nothing but scrubland, occasional cacti, and a sky full of stars. I was making good time when I saw the glow of what seemed like a gas station in the distance. It was strange because I'd driven this route a few times before and didn't remember any stops in that stretch. As I got closer, I saw an old, run-down gas station with a flickering neon sign that read, "Last Stop Gas." I figured I could use a stretch and maybe a coffee to keep me alert, so I decided to pull in. The place looked like it hadn't seen maintenance in decades. The windows were dusty, the paint was peeling, and there was an old payphone booth covered in graffiti. I didn't see any other vehicles or people around, but the lights were on inside the store. I walked in, and the doorbell jingled, echoing in the quiet night. The inside was just as decrepit as the outside. Shelves were half empty, stocked with expired snacks and dusty trinkets. I made my way to the counter, but there was no one there. I called out, "Hello?" but only got silence in return. After a minute, I shrugged it off, grabbed a soda from the fridge, and left a couple of bucks on the counter. As I turned to leave, I noticed a bulletin board near the entrance. It was covered with missing persons flyers. A chill ran down my spine when I saw how many there were, all from the surrounding areas and all within the past couple of years. I got back into my truck and continued my journey, trying to shake off the weird vibes. As I drove, I started feeling uneasy, like I was being watched. The road ahead was dark, and my headlights only pierced so far into the blackness. After about an hour, I saw headlights behind me. It was strange because I hadn't seen another vehicle since I left the gas station. The headlights kept getting closer and closer until they were almost blinding in my mirrors. I tried to wave them around me, but they stayed right on my tail. Annoyed and a bit freaked out, I sped up, but so did they. Then, without warning, the lights veered off the road and vanished into the desert. I couldn't see where they went. It was like they just disappeared. I was on edge now, constantly checking my mirrors, expecting those lights to reappear. But they didn't. I kept driving, and soon enough I crossed into California. My nerves started to settle as I got closer to civilization. I chalked up the weirdness to exhaustion and pushed on until I reached a truck stop just outside Bakersfield. After parking, I went inside to get some food and maybe catch a nap. While eating, I struck up a conversation with another trucker. I mentioned the strange gas station and the headlights that had followed me. The guy went pale and told me that the gas station I described burned down years ago, killing the owner inside. It had been abandoned ever since. He said there were stories about that stretch of road, about people disappearing and phantom vehicles. Some drivers refused to take that route at night. I laughed it off, but I couldn't shake the feeling that what I'd experienced was real. I finished my meal, got some rest, and completed my delivery without further incident. But even now, whenever I drive through Nevada, I can't help but think about that night. I always keep my eyes peeled for that old gas station, but I've never seen it again. It's like it vanished into thin air, leaving behind only the memory of a sleepless night and a sense of dread that still haunts me. It was winter, and the weather was brutal. Snowstorm warnings were all over the radio, but I had a deadline to meet, so I pushed on. I was cruising along Interstate 80, somewhere near Rawlins, Wyoming. If you know that stretch, you know it's barren. Just miles of nothing but snow and the occasional truck stop. The snow was coming down hard, and visibility was getting worse by the minute. I decided to pull into a rest area I spotted ahead. It was one of those small ones, just a few parking spots, and a basic shelter with a bathroom. I parked my rig and went inside to warm up and wait out the worst of the storm. The place was empty, which wasn't surprising given the weather. I sat down on one of the benches and pulled out my thermos, pouring myself a cup of coffee. As I sipped, I noticed a strange smell in the air, like something rotten. I tried to ignore it, figuring it was just the old building. After about an hour, I was feeling restless. The storm wasn't letting up, but I needed to get moving. Just as I was about to head back to my truck, the door creaked open and a man stumbled in. He was covered in snow, shivering violently. His clothes were torn, and he looked like he'd been out in the storm for a while. I asked if he was okay, but he just mumbled something I couldn't understand. I offered him some coffee, and he nodded, still shivering. As he warmed up, he started to talk more clearly. He said his name was Tom, and that his car had broken down a few miles back. He'd been walking through the storm, hoping to find help. I told him he could ride with me to the next town, and he seemed grateful. We headed out to my truck, the snow crunching under our boots. Once inside, I cranked up the heat and got back on the highway. The storm was still raging, but at least we were moving. Tom was quiet at first, staring out the window. After a while, he started to open up. He mentioned he was on his way to visit family in Cheyenne, but got lost in the storm. As he talked, I noticed something odd. His clothes were old, like really old-fashioned, and his speech had a strange, almost outdated rhythm to it. I didn't think much of it at the time, just figured he was a bit eccentric. We drove for another hour, and the storm finally started to let up. The sky was clearing, and I could see the outline of the mountains ahead. I told Tom we were getting close to a town where he could get some proper help. That's when things got weird. Tom started to get agitated, saying he couldn't go into town, that he needed to be dropped off before we got there. I tried to reassure him, but he kept insisting. Finally, I pulled over at a rest area just outside of Laramie, figuring he could call someone from there. He thanked me and got out of the truck. As he walked away, I felt this strange sense of unease, like something wasn't right. I watched him disappear into the shadows, then got back on the road. I radioed ahead to let the rest area attendants know there was a guy who might need help. I made it to Denver without any more issues, but the whole encounter stuck with me. A few weeks later, I was back on that route and decided to stop at the same rest area. I asked the attendant if they'd seen Tom, describing him in detail. The attendant looked at me with a puzzled expression and said that I'm the third trucker to ask about that guy. Thing is, no one ever saw him here, and the cameras didn't pick up anyone matching his description. Turns out there's an old local legend about a man who froze to death near that stretch of highway back in the 1920s. Folks say his spirit wanders the road, trying to find his way home. I don't know if I believe in ghosts, but I know what I saw, and it still freaks me out. It was a cold autumn night, and I was driving up Interstate 84 through Oregon. The sky was overcast, and the only light came from my truck's headlights cutting through the darkness. I was making good time, and I planned to stop at a rest area near Pendleton for a quick nap before pushing on. Around midnight, I was driving through the Blue Mountains when I saw a woman standing on the side of the road. She was wearing a thin dress, totally unsuitable for the cold weather, and she looked distressed. My first thought was to keep driving. I've always heard you should never pick up hitchhikers, especially in the middle of nowhere at night. But something about her seemed different. She looked genuinely scared and in need of help. Against my better judgment, I slowed down and pulled over a few yards ahead of her. She quickly ran to the passenger side and climbed in before I could even say anything. I asked her where she was headed, but she just mumbled something about needing to get away. She didn't have any belongings, not even a jacket, which was odd. As I drove, I tried to make conversation, but she barely responded. She just kept looking over her shoulder like she was expecting someone to follow us. After a few awkward minutes, she finally told me her name was Emily, and she'd been stranded after her car broke down. She didn't say much else, just that she needed to get to the next town. We rode in silence for a while. The only sound was the hum of the engine and the occasional rustle of her shifting in her seat. Suddenly, I noticed another set of headlights in my mirrors. They were far behind, but it was strange because I hadn't seen another car for hours. As we drove on, the headlights kept getting closer, but no matter how fast I went, they matched my speed. Emily noticed too and started to panic, begging me to drive faster. I was officially freaked out but kept driving, hoping we'd reach a town soon. The headlights got so close that they were blinding, and then they swerved off the road, disappearing into the trees. I was about to breathe a sigh of relief when I saw a sign for a rest area up ahead. I decided to pull in, thinking we could figure out what to do next. When I parked, Emily jumped out of the truck and ran to the restroom. I followed, but by the time I got there, she was gone. I searched the whole rest area, but there was no sign of her. It was like she had vanished into thin air. The rest area was completely deserted, and there were no other cars around. Confused and a bit scared, I went back to my truck and sat there, trying to make sense of what had happened. After a few minutes, I decided to call it in. I reported what had happened to the local police, but they didn't find anything. They said they'd keep an eye out, but I could tell they didn't believe me. I got back on the road and continued my journey, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting those headlights to reappear, but they never did. A few days later, I found out that a woman matching Emily's description had gone missing in the area months before. Her car had been found abandoned, but she was never seen again. Some people say she was running from someone. Others think she met with foul play. I don't know what to believe, but I'll never forget that night, or the look of sheer terror in her eyes. Since then, I've been more cautious about who I pick up on the road. The open highway holds many mysteries, and not all of them can be explained. This happened about 5 years ago when I was running a route from Atlanta to Houston. I've driven that route countless times, but this trip was different. It was late summer, and I was making good time on Interstate 10. The weather was hot and sticky even at night. I remember it was around 2 a.m. when I started feeling really tired. I decided to pull over at a truck stop in a small town called Vinton, just across the Louisiana border. It was one of those places that looked like it had seen better days, but I figured it was good enough for a quick nap. I parked my rig in the back corner of the lot, away from the few other trucks that were there. The truck stop had a diner attached to it, so I went inside to grab a coffee before hitting the bunk. The place was almost empty, just a couple of locals and an old waitress who looked like she'd been working there for decades. I got my coffee and sat down, feeling the fatigue slowly slipping away. As I sat there, I noticed a man in a booth at the far end of the diner. He was staring at me with this intense, almost creepy look. He was scruffy, wearing old clothes that looked like they hadn't been washed in weeks. I tried to ignore him, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. After finishing my coffee, I headed back to my truck. The lot was eerily quiet, with only the distant hum of the freeway breaking the silence. I climbed into the cab and locked the doors, something I always do as a precaution. I settled into the sleeper berth and closed my eyes, but sleep didn't come easily. My mind kept drifting back to that creepy guy in the diner. I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, I was jolted awake by a loud bang on my driver's side door. My heart was pounding as I sat up and looked out the window. Standing there, illuminated by the dim light of the truck stop, was the same man from the diner. He was banging on my door, yelling something I couldn't make out. I grabbed my phone and called 911, telling the operator what was happening. She said she'd send a patrol car, but it would take a few minutes. Meanwhile, the guy kept banging on the door, trying to get in. I reached under my seat for the tire iron I kept there and held it tightly, ready to defend myself if he managed to break the window. After what felt like an eternity, I saw the flashing lights of a police car pulling into the lot. The man saw it too and took off, running into the darkness. The officers arrived and took my statement, but they couldn't find him. They suggested I move on to a different truck stop, just to be safe. I didn't need any more convincing. I drove another hour down the road to a more populated rest area, my nerves on edge the whole way. I barely slept that night, every noise making me jump. The next morning, I heard from another trucker that there had been several incidents in the area recently, with reports of a man harassing drivers at night. I never saw that guy again, but every time I pass through Louisiana, I think about that night. It's a reminder to always stay vigilant and trust your instincts. The road can be a dangerous place, not just because of the miles you travel, but because of the people you might meet along the way. Stay safe out there, friends, and always keep your doors locked. Thank you for watching. If you found these stories gripping, don't forget to subscribe for more spine-tingling content. For another hair-raising tale, check out our suggested video. And if you're hungry for more eerie encounters, dive into our playlist featuring similar chilling narratives.